Thank you to the programming committee, including most obviously the late Ruth McCrides, whom I never had the pleasure of meeting in person, although we did have an email exchange before her passing. And I want to begin with two brief confessions slash disclaimers. One, I think you probably got from John's introduction, which is I am not a Byzantinist. Most of my, in fact, all of my research really has focused on the late Roman West, on Italy in particular, Gaul and North Africa. But I like to think we're all interested in one iteration of the Roman Empire or another. I should also say that I am by training and by, I don't know, intuition, as it were, a cultural and social historian. And I have only really very recently become interested in environmental history, environmental humanities. So what I'm presenting today is really some thoughts coming from somebody who is not at the center of this paleo-scientific revolution, as it were, in historical studies, but someone who's slightly outside of it, but who is really interested in trying to figure out how I can use it with text, which is more of my sort of comfort zone. So let me just start. The very timely topic that ties us all together this long weekend, nature and the environment, reflects what is sometimes referred to as the material turn. While definitions will vary, I would define the material turn as a move towards models of knowledge, ontology, and analysis that are not oriented exclusively around social construction and language, and which takes seriously the historical agency of non-human entities, be they animals, solar radiation, volcanoes, hailstorms, or parasites. The idea that objects, animals, and other non-human entities shape the development of human affairs, that they possess historical agency in some form, has forced scholars to rethink some of our basic assumptions about government, power, and culture. The non-human environment, whether we're talking trees or bacteria, is not some kind of inert backdrop on the human stage of history. Rather, the non-human must be studied and understood in its own right as one of many elements in the unfolding events and the driving of processes. Of course, the challenge at the heart of this relatively new scholarly endeavor, at least for those of us working in late antiquity and Byzantine history, is less the question of what than how to study and understand the irreducibly complex relationship between human and non-human. And as scholars of the pre-modern world, we are, I think, especially challenged by this inquiry. Modern observers of the environment use an array of tools for measuring human and non-human. They have access to instrumental data, and they are embedded within systems structured by statistical knowledge and by related concepts such as risk. They can literally see things at macroscopic and microscopic levels of existence. So think everything from an El Nino to aDNA. Late antique and Byzantine observers, however, had none of these tools and data and had no concept of statistical thinking or, at least in my opinion, of living in a risk society. To complicate matters further, they could see things that we cannot. They saw demons, for example, as material entities whose agency was always complex and could never be taken for granted. Divine power, too, was highly visible in their material world, whether through signs and portents or in more decidedly disastrous events like an earthquake or tsunami. All of these contrasting points inflect how we study nature and the environment. And as the program of our conference demonstrates quite clearly and nicely, we study these subjects in rather different ways. The program's organization reflects the wide spectrum of historical environmental studies. On the one end, there are those whose work can be grouped under headings like eco-criticism, eco-poetics, new materialism, and the environmental humanities. Now, these are hardly interchangeable labels, and the papers we saw on Saturday and Sunday earlier in the afternoon mirror the range, the papers mirror the range of approaches, but what links them together is what we might describe as a post-structuralist analytical stance with the use of evidence that derives exclusively really from texts and visual sources. We might compare, for example, Jane Bond's paper, who reads her sources through tools from literary criticism and intellectual history, teasing out biblical, Aristotelian, and folk understandings of weather events, with Adam Goldwyn's, whose paper reflected the activist ethos of many eco-critical approaches, with his juxtaposition of contemporary environmental movements in Oregon with historicizing queries about effective relationships between humans and non-humans, trees, not exclusively, but in particular. On the other end of the spectrum, there are those scholars whose interpretive approaches are in many ways quite traditional. They're all empirical, some we might even describe as neo-positivistic, but whose source base is downright radical. Proxy evidence like ice cores, tree rings, aDNA, and subfossil pollen, which can only be studied initially, at least, by paleoscientists. Adam Izdebski's opening talk and Tim Newfield's paper on the 536-550 climate downturn provided a great introduction to this kind of research. Now, I have no intention of critiquing this division of the field between literary folks and the scientific oriented. In fact, I want to celebrate it. And I am increasingly of the mind that we should restrain attempts to integrate these different ways of studying nature and the environment into a single approach. I am especially opposed to what some scholars call consilience, a term popularized by the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson. For Wilson, consilience constitutes a materialist worldview, and with it, the possibility of seamlessly integrating humanistic and scientific research into a grand unified theory of knowledge, wherein all aspects of human and non-human existence can ultimately be explained by the laws of physics. Now, most of my colleagues who use the term are hardly this reductive or scientistic, but their invocation of the concept certainly implies that they believe one can theoretically integrate the environmental humanities with paleoscience if we just work harder to understand both and or put more money and effort into collaborative research on the model of the sciences. Now, to be sure, and I want to be clear here, I'm not against any of these things. Collaborative research involving paleoscientists and humanistic scholars has generated what is arguably the most significant path of scholarly innovation in a generation. And we can now actually consider how macroscopic climate change and microscopic biological agents may have shaped the long history of the Roman Empire. Such work must continue, and my following comments are intended to push these collaborations forward, but perhaps in different ways. For what we have not yet resolved, in my opinion, is precisely what this interdisciplinary relationship is supposed to look like in practice. Whose knowledge and whose data will take precedent in the process of producing narratives about the past? Will science serve history or history science? And is something like consilience possible or even desirable? My short answer to these last questions is no and no. To be frank, many publications that blend historical with paleoscientific evidence do not produce consilience, at least in this idea of a single grand unified theory. Rather, they produce what scholars of educational practices refer to as the, quote, subordination service model of interdisciplinarity, wherein one discipline is invoked to serve the epistemological goals of the other. For example, paleoscientists like to cite historical sources and scholarship to help them date their findings because chronological resolution for proxy data, at least in terms of genetics, still remains relatively imprecise. Thus, in the rightfully acclaimed Keller et al. 2019 study of aDNA evidence for Yersinia pestis, and this was an article that's come up at least once in Lee's paper, the authors who include at least one historian, cite a study of ecclesiastical sources in Spain in order to more precisely date the graves from which some of their genetic samples derived, since carbon-14 dating regions are so wide. The authors didn't engage with the historical sources on any level, or even the main arguments of the said article on ecclesiastical material, except to use it to assert that their genetic evidence lined up chronologically with the more temporally precise historical evidence. Now, we might be quick to blame the scientist for his rudimentary appreciation of the historical method as little more than a dating convention. But historians can also privilege scientifically derived evidence even when they use this evidence to support what is an historical narrative. I discussed this problem in some detail in my 2019 article that John mentioned, so here I'm going to be quite brief. In addition to using historical sources simply to corroborate the proxy data, some historians invoke scientific data because they perceive it as epistemologically superior to historical data and results, and hence a stronger form of evidence. Put another way, historians sometimes use science not for the actual knowledge that it offers, but for what they believe it represents. Rock-solid proof produced in the laboratory, which cannot be challenged in the same way as our constructed cultural evidence. And just two little asides here. One is that I think scholars in STS, in science and technology studies, have critiqued this idea about scientific knowledge somehow being purer than other forms of knowledge, of being not socially constructed in some way. This has been heavily critiqued, and more, to the point of our discussion the last few days, I just want to underscore what Tim Newfield kept repeating many times, which is that scientific evidence is about uncertainty, that it changes radically very quickly. And I think a lot of times historians don't really grasp that scientific evidence isn't something that is absolute 100% from the get-go. It is also a process. Now, one example of this rhetorical privileging, that's really what I'm getting at with the historians of science, is Michael McCormick's most recent essay on plague in the writings of Gregory of Tours, which was published just this past winter, in Speculum. Which of course is the big, you all know that it's the Western medievalists mostly published in that. Building on the previously mentioned Keller et al. Study, which recovered plague A DNA from human remains in Gaul, Spain, and Britain, and hence adding to our known samples, which were previously limited to Germany, McCormick makes much of the fact that we have found Yersinia pestis in places otherwise unattested in our literary sources. But what will this aDNA tell us? What exactly is it evidence for? For the paleogeneticists in the Keller et al. Article, the aDNA samples allowed them to reconstruct several new genomes and hence to build a more complex phylogeny for the pathogen. In fact, the 2019 study hypothesized that Yersinia pestis bacteria were endemic in Western regions of the late and post-Roman Empire, popping up again and again from the early 540s when they were first introduced. Yet, while McCormick is well aware of the scientists' hypothesis, in fact, he was part of the team that authored the study, his article doesn't use the science to explore its suggestive historical implications, that is, that the disease was endemic. Rather, he uses their data largely to shore up Gregory's reputation as an authority on plague in 6th century Gaul. Gregory, he concludes, accurately records the disease and its transmission around Gaul in his writings because the scientific evidence confirms it. Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong, and I am not criticizing in any kind of negative way McCormick's largely rhetorical use of the science in this study. His argument for Gregory's reliability as a plague source is unquestionably a strong one. My point is simply that his scholarly goals in this article bear little relationship to the scientist's goal, whose data form a core part of his evidence. What we find in these two studies, in other words, is not consilience. what we find is the subordination service mode of interdisciplinarity. More to my point, rather than continue our search for the holy grail of consilience, whatever that would mean or look like, I suggest that we accept the deep methodological and evidentiary differences between science and humanistic research and use them to our heuristic advantage. So let me conclude now with a preliminary set of ideas to this end. What if we, and by we, I mean largely cultural historians like myself, who are interested in how people perceived and experienced their many different late antique environments and Byzantine environments, what if we use the paleoscience differently, not as a form of putatively superior proof in a positivistic argument, but as an analytic tool for a set of cultural inquiries? More specifically, I suggest that we bring paleoscience to bear on our historical sources as a means for differentiating how people perceived and experienced their environments in the past from how we perceive and experience them in the present. We should use the science not merely to probe the limits of what our earlier historical actors didn't know, which is undoubtedly a great deal. Rather, we should use the science to elucidate the places where they conceptualized and lived in the natural world, its properties, its rules, its dynamics, in ways that don't map onto our modern scientific frame. So let me give you an example of what I mean. And here I must absolutely apologize for yanking you all to the far western quarters, to go actually that far west, to the Alps, to Gaul, to Lake Geneva, and to the writings of two very un-Byzantine late 6th century authors, Gregory of Tours, whom I know everybody knows, and the other is Marius of Avenches, who's perhaps a little less well known. He was a Burgundian chronicler who's a direct contemporary of Gregory. So in book 4, chapter 31 of his 10 books of histories, the 6th century bishop Gregory of Tours depicts what is known as the Tauredunum Event of 563, a massive rock slide in the Alps that, after destroying persons and property in its path, deposited tons of debris into the waters of the Rhone. This debris, in turn, indirectly caused a massive tsunami on Lake Geneva, which Gregory claims took out persons and property along the lakeshore and breached Geneva's city walls. And Tauredunum, by the way, is a place name, and it's either the name of this particular custrum that Gregory identifies as having been destroyed by the rock slide, or according to our other source, which I'll get to in a second, Marius of Avenches, it's the name of the mountain that collapses. Significantly, Gregory, as I mentioned, is not our only late ancient historical source for the Tauredunum event. His contemporary, the Burgundian chronicler Marius of Avenches, also describes the landslide and tsunami. Now, Marius's account is not identical to Gregory's, but the two clearly depict the same event and construct a very similar chain of movements. A mountain rock slide causes destruction on land and deaths of people. The debris from the landslide disturbs the lake, whose waters cause damage along the shores of Lake Geneva. And I should say, Gregory certainly was not an eyewitness to this event. I don't know about Marius of Avenches. Avenches is northwest of Lake Geneva. He's certainly much more regionally positioned to have possibly witnessed this in some way, although, again, I suspect not. I think they're both reporting in Gregory's case clearly, and in Marius's case likely what they've heard. Thanks to these two historical accounts of the tsunami, the Tauredunum event has become something of a cause célèbre among historical seismologists. In the 2010s, a team of Swiss geologists investigated this event using scientific methods, and they published their findings in Nature Geoscience in 2012. And I should say, this was actually, when it came out, it made a huge splash in the media. This image you're seeing and the blurb, this is actually from The Economist, which featured the Nature Geoscience, or a short, it's a very short, it's a letter actually, a very short piece about their research. There's also a museum in Nyon that has now a permanent site dedicated to this event. And there is, in fact, a film, a documentary, which I have yet to get my hands on, that was produced and released in 2019 on this. And there's a couple of short little films on YouTube if you're interested that produce little documentaries about this. So this was a big deal, particularly to the Swiss, for obvious reasons. The research team conducted an offshore survey of the deepest parts of Lake Geneva and used high-resolution seismic reflection profiles to image its sedimentation history. They also retrieved 4 sediment cores, which they used for carbon dating. Now, using these tools and this material, they discovered a massive sediment deposit beneath the lake bed that seems to have been the result of a large mass movement. The deposit is thickest in the southeast corner, which they believe hints at the place of the event's origin in the Rhone Delta, precisely where Gregory says it started. Though through carbon-14 dating, they confirmed the age of the sediment to have been deposited sometime between 381 and 612 CE, which fits with Gregory's general chronological frame and Marius's precise date of 563. However, when we turn to the geologist's hypothesis regarding the geological mechanisms that created the tsunami, science's glove fits a lot less snugly on history's hand. According to a reconstruction of the event via computer modeling, part of the Rhone Delta collapsed with the landslide and created something called a mixed turbidity current, which is an underwater current of usually rapidly moving sediment-laden water moving down a slope, which in turn caused sediment to collapse at the bottom of the lake. It was this collapsed, destabilized sediment that displaced the water and caused the tsunami on the lake's surface. So whereas Gregory and Marius think the mountain slide sort of deposited the water, which kind of deposited the debris, which offset the water, causing the tsunami, actually it was a more complex set of events that involved the collapse of the sediment in the lake bed, which is what caused the tsunami. Additionally, their modeling of the tsunami suggests that the wave moved across the lake at 70 kilometers per hour and ranged in height between 16 meters at the point of onset, 13 meters on the Lucerne side, 15 minutes after the mass movement of debris, and 8 meters on the Geneva side after 70 minutes. So this was enormous. This was no small little wave. Gregory and Marius's accounts, in other words, roughly fit the scientific narrative and offer a more precise date, but neither perceived what the scientists perceived through their proxies, instruments, and modeling: the high speed and enormous size of the waves, the precise fluvial and seismic mechanisms that created the tsunami, the sediment cores, and the biological materials therein used for carbon-14 dating, and the underwater sedimentary layers of the lake bed. So if I had my guess, and I'm guessing because I have yet to find anyone from our world really picking up on this interesting event or the material in our sources, in our historical sources, many historians of the environment would simply stop their analysis here, happily armed with a basic conjuncture between the historical sources and the paleoscientific data, and forever satisfied that science once again provides the more accurate narrative of what took place. Modern scientists certainly tells us what our 6th century authors couldn't see or understand. But let's consider how it might tell us something about what they could see about their respective environments. For example, while the geologists visualize the event largely from beneath the water by studying sediment at the bottom of the lake, Gregory and Marius take a bird's eye view, looking down from above and explaining the tsunami as formed by a disturbance of the water through displacement by the mountain landslide into the Rhone Delta. Consider Gregory's descriptive analysis of the aquatic disturbance on the slide. And here I quote, "It is told by many that the mass of water was so great that it went over the walls into the city mentioned. And there is no doubt of this tale because we have said the Rhone flows in that region between mountains that hem it in closely. And being so closely shut in, it has no place to turn aside." Gregory, in other words, perceives the event at geographic scale and emphasizes hydrological movements, though it's a decidedly different view from the underwater perspective of the geologists. And I'm thinking back now to Liz James's wonderful talk yesterday, whether in a sense he gives us more of a landscape purview. And I'm thinking about whether in some ways he has in mind some of the more stylized maps from late antiquity. Obviously, he wouldn't have known the Medaba map, but something along those lines. Another question everyone seems to ask, how big was the tsunami? So both the paleoscientists, our historical seismologists, and our historical actors all want to know, how big was it? The geologists used computer modeling to measure the wave size and speed, estimating that it was 16 meters at onset, 8 meters by the time it hit Geneva and 8 meters by the time it hit Geneva at the other end of the lake. Gregory and Marius estimated size too, both qualitatively through references to the destruction of property, people, and infrastructure. Geneva's walls, Gregory and both Marius point out. Marius also mentions a bridge taken out as well as a mill. And quantitatively in the case of Marius, who claims, I can go back here, who claims that the disturbance on the water measured 20 by 60 miles. Now, if you do the math, he's actually, and account for the fact that he's talking about Roman miles versus the English mile and so on and so forth. If you do the math, he's not actually all that off in terms of the wave size relative to the expanse of Lake Geneva. But this, of course, is not the point. The point is that our late Roman authors also attempted to measure the environmental event, though interestingly, in a manner that seems to underestimate its size. And I think this is interesting because historians typically observe how our sources exaggerate the size of natural disasters. In this case, neither one of them could really grasp that we're talking about, at one point, a 13-meter wave hitting the shores of Luzon and an 8-meter wave hitting Geneva. And I want to just sort of point us back to this as being a kind of recurring issue and theme that something I think we all need to talk about more, which is number and counting, and how do our late Roman and Byzantine sources count? How do they perceive number? Obviously, we'll say it's more in a qualitative sense in many cases, particularly when it comes to body counts in disease events. But I actually think there's a lot of work we need to do and work with people who do work on historical mathematics and number and information sciences. There's a wonderful new book by a classicist named Andrew Rigsby on the visualization of information, which talks a little bit about number. And I think actually this is an area that we all need to do more. Body counts are all over the place, and not just for military disasters. And I think we need to think more what they do rhetorically, what they do historically. Finally, and back to the event. Finally, and most complexly, everyone is interested in agency and causation. Needless to say, here is ostensibly the widest gap between the scientific and the historical sources. For unlike our Swiss geologists, I assume, obviously, maybe they think this too, but obviously their study does not suggest it, Gregory and Marius both conceptualize the natural world as part of a larger, divinely ordained, empowered cosmos, wherein all human and non-human actions can ultimately be explained through recourse to divine providence. To this point, when Gregory introduces the Tauredunum event in the beginning of chapter 31 of book 4, he refers to it as a great prodigy, a portent that precedes other disastrous developments. And actually, notably in this case, it's a portent of the arrival of plague, of Yersinia pestis plague in Gregory's own hometown of Clermont in around 571. So this disaster is actually a portent of another disaster, a disease event. God's displeasure, Gregory and Marius would agree, is enacted through the environment. Nevertheless, I would argue that both, and especially Gregory, whose account is much longer and more detailed, but I would argue that both, and especially Gregory, perceive nature as more complex than just a playing field for acts of divine punishment. For Gregory also observes the activity of non-divine or perhaps sub-divine agents driving the event. And go back to this quote. The mountain that crashes down on the people and their property, the sudden and violent flood that acts upon the banks of the lake, destroying houses, killing animals, and breaking walls. It's worth pointing out that Gregory, like many ancient and late ancient authors, was fascinated by the destructive dynamism of moving water, and water's come up in a lot of the talks in the last couple of days, and that his thinking on the matter was informed by classical cosmologies, which he learned not only by reading Virgil, and in fact, at the end of chapter 30 of book 4, there's a quote where he quotes Virgil and the Aeneid. And it's actually a quote to a scene about a river, interestingly, but also sources on ancient astronomy. And it's not as well known as Gregory's other historiographical and hagiographical works, but Gregory actually wrote a treatise on astronomy. It's called De Cursus Stellarum. So this was something he was genuinely interested in. And I think you can see it if we read his work carefully. And again, with and against the science. To conclude, I hope the last few minutes with the very Latinate Gregory and Marius have given you a sense of the possibilities, not of consilience, but of the kinds of productive fractious dialogues we might create by placing science and history into conversations, where we search not simply for matches between data sets, but also for mismatches, which historians, I think, are especially skilled at exploiting for insight and information. And so let me just close by again lauding the program coordinators for creating a conference that really brings together, perhaps not in fractious dialogue, but in conversation, so many different approaches to nature and environments. Thank you. I will stop sharing now.